You're listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we're tuning into Neurodiversity at Work, a session that was presented virtually during Winter Institute 2021.
Welcome to the panel on neurodiversity in bookselling.
Neurodiversity is a very broad concept because there are many kinds of neurodiversity. There are various points along the spectrums of neurodiversity, and every neurodiverse person is just as unique as neurotypical people. So that said, this is a very important start in a conversation to address the challenges and concerns that our neurodiverse employees and bookstore managers experience in their work and our customers experience in our stores. So we hope that this panel of our neurodiverse individuals and advocates can provide some context for those of you who are not very familiar with neurodiversity and give you a sense of community and support if you are part of the neurodiverse community. ABA looks forward to continuing to create dialogue around this discussion, which is very multifaceted and intersectional. So today's 1 hour discussion will be an introduction to 4 concepts in the area of neurodiverse inclusion. We'll cover what neurodiversity is, give you 2 perspectives on neurodiverse experiences, talk about communication for inclusivity, and talk about how bookstores can be more inclusive places overall. And I just want to acknowledge each of these could take up an entire session or even its own institute, but we're excited to have these as starting points for future discussions within the bookselling community. So first, my name is Emily Autenrieth. I am a bookstore owner. I own a Seat at the Table Books, which is in Elk Grove, just south of Sacramento. We're in pop-up form, working into our brick and mortar later this year, so wish me luck there. I am the child of neurodiverse people and the parent of a neurodiverse person, and myself identify as part of the broader community of people who have some traits that are neurodiverse or relate better to neurodiverse styles of communication, even if we are not diagnosable or diagnosed. So I'm very interested in the kind of inclusion that we can offer for everyone, no matter how they identify or what their history is. Here we have Katy Alexander first. She is the Global Director of Marketing for Digital Science, which is a technology company that serves the needs of scientific and research communities at key points along the full cycle of research. She is also the founder of edu-game company, The Remarkables. Katy, can you tell us how neurodiversity plays a role in your work and your life?
I think it's really shaped who I am. It's been different at all stages in my career. So starting out, maybe it was a bit more of a struggle, a bit more of what I thought was a hindrance that I probably put on myself as well. Less kind of open and willing to ask for help because of the kind of stigma and humiliation that went with it. Kind of now, 20 years into my career, it can still be a struggle. I think lockdown has probably reminded me of that. But I think it's also affected it in a great way because I tend to think outside the box. It's just a default setting I have. So I will usually come at a problem in a way that most people won't. And I usually will plan as well. So if I do see that there's something up ahead, I will always kind of think of what are some of the outcomes that could happen if, A is triggered. Will then, B and C topple, will D happen? So you have to think ahead because you're constantly having to put in these coping mechanisms to get you ready for your just a day at work.
Thank you. That's a lot of work. I appreciate you sharing about that. Jory Fleming recently completed a Master's of Philosophy in Environmental Change and Management at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. Alongside his service dog, Daisy, who is adorable, Jory works in climate and is invested in children's education and raising awareness about disabilities. And I know I personally am very excited about Jory's forthcoming book. So Jory, can you talk to us about how neurodiversity relates to your work and life?
I sure can. Thanks, Emily. My name is Jory, and I'm an author, as Emily mentioned, of a forthcoming book about autism called How to Be Human, An Autistic Man's Guide to Life. And I hope that the conversations between Lyric and I really offer readers a window into a mind that's quite different from their own. And another aspect of my work where I see my autism come into play is climate change. And that's an issue that I am both passionate about and work in. And I think one of the, of course, there are many ways to think about climate, but I think one of them could be, the fact that there's a relationship between people and the land and the earth that is problematic. I guess one way you could put that as a bit of an understatement. But so it's maybe a bit of an oxymoron that somebody that has difficulty with relationships in many ways is working in this space. But as Katy mentioned, I think it can give you a new perspective that can be really valuable. And of course, autism comes up in both positive and negative ways in many, many aspects of my life. And I'm really excited to maybe share some of those as part of our conversation today. So thanks for that introduction, Emily.
Thank you. We're excited to hear more. And finally, Ed Thompson is the CEO and founder of Uptimize. This is a unique training platform that helps organizations attract, hire, and retain talent that thinks differently. Ed, can you tell us how neurodiversity relates to your work and life?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Ed Thompson. I'm CEO and founder of Uptimize. We are the leading corporate training company in the field of neurodiversity work. I'm originally from London, but now I and Uptimize are based in Denver. My route to neurodiversity at work was actually an unusual one in that it wasn't driven by a personal or familial connection to neurodivergence, at least not at the beginning. I worked in tech in London. I got involved in strategic diverse recruitment. So companies such as mine at the time were struggling and still are struggling to attract and hire and retain the talent that they need. I helped to create paths for them to connect with high potential but overlooked talent pools. And initially in London in that program, we focused on connecting tech companies with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who'd grown up with tech, so obviously had something to offer, but who wouldn't necessarily have found those opportunities and vice versa. So it was after that, through a suggestion from a family member here in the States who is neurodivergent and a lifelong neurodiversity advocate, I got interested at the time in what was the very embryonic field of neurodiversity at work, so 5 years ago or so. And I saw it really in very similar terms from the work that I'd done before. Organizations need talent, they need this sort of precious diversity of thought. And here's a huge demographic that they've simply not done enough to hire and include effectively. So I founded Uptimize to fill that gap. And from the beginning, we focused on training organizations to be more aware and more inclusive, realizing that this is a key part of the puzzle that until then had been missing. So we've worked with some really big companies, Salesforce, Microsoft, Intel, Google. These programs have either been sort of hiring programs specifically, so how do we deliberately hire a bunch of people who are neurodistinct, or an increasingly now sort of more substantial company-wide change programs, essentially recognizing, I think, that actually no sort of core goal around an organization and its people, whether it's, hiring the best people, whether it's making people comfortable, whether it's getting people to work together effectively, whether it's, developing talent, we're never actually going to achieve any of those basic goals that all organizations share. If we don't take into account that people naturally process information differently, experience the world differently, have different communication preferences, present differently, and problem solve in different ways. And what we've seen so far, and this is still a relatively new field, but what we've seen is that through building awareness and appreciation of these neuro differences, we really have seen great things happen. We've seen organizations find, attract, hire talent that they, even by their own admission, say that they would have never hired before. We've seen them retain talent much more effectively. We've seen greater productivity and organizations really building their innovative capacity with some great stories of innovation responding to the COVID crisis. So I'm happy to be here today. A bookstore is not the same as a Microsoft or a Google, clearly, but any organization is just a group of people drawn from its wider society. And I think though some of the terminology and tools might be different, really the needs and the principles are very much the same. I'm also writing my own book on the neurodiversity at work movement. Not sure when that will be released, but hopefully in the next few months. And I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of the discussion.
Thank you all so much for your introductions and for being willing to give us your time today. So first, let's just talk about the concept of neurodiversity. For a lot of our members, it's a pretty new idea, and it's such a broad idea. So can each of you share what neurodiversity means in your life and more broadly? We can start with Katy again.
Great, thanks. So I'm dyslexic, and dyslexia is a learning difference that it really impacts information processing. So a lot of the time we'll think, it's just reading and writing, but it's more about how you process information, and we remember information differently. It can also impact organizational skills because it affects your short-term verbal memory. So I think the most important is kind of the coping mechanisms that are key. And it's being able to really make sure that those coping mechanisms are put in place as early on as possible. Yeah, so that's kind of a summary of dyslexia and how it impacts me. But there are a lot of different types of dyslexia, and everyone will feel it differently and have slightly different needs and manifestations of it. So,
thank you. How about you, Jory?
I have autism, and Ed was mentioning a bunch of different technology companies, and one out of perhaps several images you could use, or at least I like to use to describe autism, is a different operating system. So if you've ever gone back and forth between Windows and Mac, many of the things you can do with the computer remain the same, but the user interface or the types of applications available to help you accomplish those goals can be different. And sometimes that has new ways of experiencing those goals or getting to a certain path. Sometimes if you're making the switch, it's harder. I mean, of course, people don't switch between having autism and not, but so that's maybe not the best image in all cases, but maybe it gives you an idea. So autism definitely affects me in a lot of ways. And as I mentioned, some positive, some negative. So just an example of a positive one is that I really like the way my memory works. I remember a lot of random things, and some of the things that I want to remember, I don't. But I actually do end up remembering a lot of stuff, and it will appear years later and it'll be like, wow, that's amazing. Thank you, brain. Some negative things is that participating in conversations, especially informal and kind of small talk conversations where interpreting emotional cues and body language, not so great. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And if you have a direct or indirect connection with somebody on the spectrum, you may have some idea of what I'm talking about. Although I will say that my autism is probably unique. And as Emily mentioned, neurodiverse people are very different from one another as well.
Thank you. How about you, Ed?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful to be clear on neurodiversity versus neurodivergence, actually, because neurodiversity fundamentally itself is nothing new. I mean, it's always been a fact of human societies, and I think it's increasingly recognized as the natural diversity of human brain wiring. Essentially everybody processes information differently. The idea that there's one sort of standard normal brain, I think has sort of been debunked, and that's why we don't have a sort of perfect normal brain in a jar somewhere in a museum. However, there are obviously some less common thinking styles and traits in the population, and the fact that some are less common, some are more common, means that some of the more common ones can lead to norms that disadvantage people in multiple overlapping neuroidentity groups, obviously, which we have many of them represented on this panel. And so, I mean, in the workplace, that's the sort of way those norms can disadvantage people would be, an over-reliance on interviewing, for example, which obviously some people can find particularly challenging or stressful, or, noisy open plan offices, which can disadvantage people who have particularly acute sensory sensitivity. So I think it's important to stress the universality of this. We have some clients who think that neurodiversity is, as it were, what do we do when somebody puts their hand up and says, I'm dyslexic? That I think is problematic, for a few reasons. I think it's problematic for one reason, because again, everybody has different communication preferences and so on. It's problematic because not everybody who is neurodistinct is necessarily going to be willing to disclose. And there are people, of course, who have the collection of traits that they would even get a diagnosis of neurodivergence, but aren't necessarily aware of it. So I think it's really important to have that sort of universal lens here, so that we don't just think, okay, what happens when somebody's an ADHD? I think that's an unnecessarily limiting frame.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So the next question is to discuss some of your perspectives on the experience of neurodiversity. So we'll be focusing on Jory and Katy here. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about is that a lot of neurotypical people worry that they will say or do the wrong thing because neurodiversity is so confusing and diverse and broad ranging and just new. So they end up maybe not doing anything because they're afraid of offending people or invalidating them. So with that in mind, can you describe some efforts to include neurodiverse people that you feel are misguided and why?
I'll start us off, I suppose. So I think when it comes to curiosity in general, I don't always mind questions. I think the framing and the intention behind the question is really important. You know, a negative framing might be like, oh, wow, like, you know, you're so much, you know, better or superior, or you don't look like or sound like you have autism, which of course implies that autism is negative, and then I should be able to carry on a conversation with you. Positive framing, though, could come out of generosity and curiosity. But I think that one of the things that I always welcome is conversations of that nature about autism, about my disabilities, with people that I know or that I feel I have some sort of relationship with. And I think it's really important to develop that. And I think booksellers can do that even if they're meeting someone for the first time. You know, maybe if you're curious, you could ask it a question about someone's disability as a second or third question instead of the first question, right? Because I imagine if they're interacting with you, they might be pretty interested in books. So I would love to interact with the bookseller, you know, in a way that focuses on books first, and maybe find an introduction of autism later in that conversation as I get to know that person.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd second that. And I think it's how the questions are framed. I think just asking the questions is so important, because a lot of the time, you know, you might not want to just talk about it. You might not want to disclose it. You might not know, you know, can I do it with this person in front of me? How are they going to react? Are they going to see me as less than I am, as less professional, less able, less capable? So it's the open conversation. It's how the questions are asked. And I've had a few experience, I think, similar to you, where it's been, oh, I wouldn't have, you know, you're dyslexic. Like I wouldn't have thought that. And not making the assumptions. So it's not, you know, everything isn't black or white. There's so many shades of gray and different, you know, it's not just writing and reading for dyslexia, for example. It affects in so many different ways and at different times in different ways. So just being aware as well. And I think some of the misguided kind of approaches I've experienced as well is, if you have someone in front of you who is being open, just listen to them. Because if they're telling you, for example, you know, when I get tired, it's really hard for me to function. And you can see they're tired, don't press them. Step back. And a lot of it just comes down to basic human interactions and decency. It's how I think we should be treating everybody. And it's with the kind of an open approach, willingness to kind of understand where anyone's coming from, what they might be experiencing, and how it impacts them, whether it's a disability or not.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what I hear both of you talking about is similar to other people from marginalized groups who don't want to be treated as the kind of the other way to be a person. There's the default, and then there's you, and you're defined by this otherness. So with that in mind, when we're creating space for how people are different, especially maybe if they've shared with us something that is different from our experience, how can we do that without making them feel like an outsider we're letting in, or just like the other?
Should I can go first, I guess, this time. So I think it comes down again to the openness, and it's listening, but it's creating the environment where so if I think about it from my career, and managing teams or being managed, it's creating the environment where I'm very open with the people around me so that they can be open back, and we can actually have a dialogue so that we can address some of these things, so that they can come to me and say, hey, I'm really sorry, but the instructions you just gave me to, for this piece of work I have to do, I have no idea what you just said, which can happen. So I can then step back and say, okay, no, that's correct, right? So I didn't explain that very well. Let's try that again. And it goes both ways. So I think in any, and I can only speak from a kind of working perspective, but within a company or a bookshop and the employees that you might manage in a bookstore, it's going to be a similar situation. And any kind of manager or leader has to also be able to show that they make mistakes, they're fallible, they're not perfect. And that creates that open dialogue that enables things to change, whether it's office settings, moving your desk because you're too close to certain lights or noises. So it's the flexibility and the openness that needs to just be there from the start.
I love that. Thank you. Jory?
Yeah, and Katy mentioned earlier that not everybody may disclose whether they're in your bookshop or your work environment more broadly. And that's definitely true. Who knows, after this book comes out, maybe that'll change, but at least in the past, I haven't gone up to people and say, hello, I'm Autistic Jory, how are you today? But in other times, friends, in many cases, colleagues do know about my disabilities, maybe not in great detail, but have a general level of awareness. And I know in my experience, I always welcome the ability to decide and interact in a manner of my choosing, in a way that's sort of respectful from my colleagues. So, colleagues often do things like, go to a bar after work, and bars not really my jam, right? It's a really sensory overload sometimes, but sometimes I'll go, sometimes I won't. I would feel bad though if I wasn't invited in the first place, because they know, oh, that's a difficult environment for Jory. Jory won't like the bar, etc., etc. But if a friend or colleague is having a birthday function at a bar, I'd probably go. I may not stay as long as everybody else. I may duck out early, but I would really still appreciate the invitation. So I think that's one example of maybe the difference, right, between kind of othering and inclusive, that's being respectful of those differences.
That is wonderful. Thank you. And the last question for this portion is, what tools or resources have helped you handle the executive functioning challenges related to being neurodiverse? And maybe you can start by explaining what we even mean by executive functioning briefly, and then what has helped you. Katy, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I think it's tricky again, because everyone will be using different tools, or need different tools. I have been throughout my career very bad at finding the things that could actually help me. So that's only something I've done recently. And I don't think there's any, fast guide. But I think one of the main things from a dyslexic perspective is the organizing. And organizing yourself can be a real challenge. So some people might want to have a journal. I kind of gravitate to tools like Trello or Monday.com, especially for managing larger teams that I might have to do at work, or projects, or other kind of work things that get thrown at me. And that helps to manage the work, but it also helps me kind of keep on track with my goals and my targets, reminds me what's coming up. But the upside is it helps everybody. I've rolled this out in so many teams over the kind of course of my career and jobs I've had, that I've noticed it helps pretty much everybody, whether you're, neurodiverse or neurotypical. And especially, if you get overwhelmed just by the sheer amount of work. So I think that can really help kind of recenter and focus on the key priorities.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one of the tools that I would recommend, or one of the types of tools. But there are others which are out there.
How about you, Jory?
Yeah, I'm glad Katie sort of went first with the definition, because I actually had to ask my mom last night, like, what is executive functioning? But once it was explained, I was like, oh yeah, one of those language things. Um, for me, I often travel when I'm going places with a carer, whether that's a family member, a friend, and I think that could be useful to know for booksellers, is that, when it comes to executive functioning, there may be more than one person involved. Um, and then, of course, in my case as well, my service animal, Daisy, is a great way to sort of help me process those things and engage in ways that I choose to. She's actually in another room, peacefully resting, or I might show you her lovely face.
Thank you. Next, let's talk about how we communicate in more inclusive ways. So this is something that's very important for customers as well as our staff. And first, I want to talk about what ableist behavior is in relation to communication so that we can talk about how to address it. Ableist behavior regarding neurotypical versus neurodiverse communication is when we treat neurotypical communication styles and needs as the default and what's normal, and then neurodiverse people's styles and needs as different, more difficult, less convenient, and less normal. So maybe we perceive a neurodiverse person as rude when they're just being direct, which is their preferred style, or we get frustrated that someone needs paperwork a day ahead of a meeting. So first, and maybe we'll start with Ed, just to give the two of you a little break. If a neurodiverse staff member, so say we know someone is neurodiverse and they communicate in their natural or their preferred style with a customer, and the customer perceives it incorrectly, how can we navigate that situation?
Yeah, I think we can try and navigate it from sort of two different ways. Essentially, I mean, I think if it's okay as a manager to work with the staff member and coach and script on the sorts of expectations you have and what you think your clients would welcome. But I think we need to also hit it from the other side, right? And I think it's quite difficult because you're trying to quite quickly build empathy and maybe a moment of pause amongst your customers that your staff may be neurodistinct. But I would suggest, and I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists say. I think some environmental stuff would actually help here in terms of building that empathy and building that moment of pause. So I would say, in a bookstore, if you had a sign on the door as you walk in about how you proudly hire a very diverse staff, and you have a very prominent display somewhere around neurodiversity, autism, and so on, I think you would be providing some environmental cues that might create some more sensitivity, and again, that sort of moment of pause on behalf of the customer.
Thank you. Jory, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that bookstores and booksellers can do, and maybe we can get into them in more detail later. But whether it's sort of sensory processing in the store, or whether it's the way that staff members communicate, or whether it's sort of the things and activities going on in connection with the bookshop, I just think there's a lot of opportunity to do things that, as I think it was Katy mentioned earlier, when you sort of make changes to make a place, a space more inclusive, it can benefit a lot of people actually with different communication styles, not just those that have autism or dyslexia or are another way neurodiverse. So I'm not sure if we want to kind of tackle those in areas or not, but I'm looking forward to that aspect of the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think we have some more questions about that later, but I appreciate you previewing that for us. Katy, any other thoughts on if there's kind of some conflict related to misperceiving what someone's intent is?
I mean, I think we all do that, even with people, even with those of us who are not neurodiverse. We we all perceive intent when someone asks us something, depending on the day we've had or the experiences that we bring to the table. So part of it is just being aware of that generally, and relating more to neurodiversity. If I look at it from a manager's perspective, and this could apply to managers in a bookstore, if you are very open and you're able to help and mentor and coach your staff, you can also help them in these situations. Because there's going to be times where they might need some help on, look, this conversation didn't go as well as it could have. Why don't we try this next time? Do you feel comfortable doing that? Mm-hmm. And helping. And there's also going to be times where you're going to have a customer who you probably don't really want in that bookstore, but you need the customer. And that's also kind of being able to be there for the staff member in situations where, and I don't know if I can say this on a recording, but some people are just jerks. And you have to be able to be there also for your team and your employees when this happens, to support them. And, if need be, kind of step in if you see it happening, or being able to support them afterwards. So I think it's a mixture of approaches.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's definitely a very nuanced issue. So with all of this nuance, just more broadly, how can we as booksellers move away from the concept that professionalism and neurotypical communication are one and the same, and foster the kind of open-minded dialogue and communication in our bookstores and in our communities that includes everyone, all styles of communicating and processing information? And Ed, are you prepared to start with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just throw sort of one thing out there. It's obviously a very different context when you're talking about, a team where there's more time all around to invest in getting to know each other than there is in just a micro customer interaction. And so to talk a little bit about the former, and when we're talking about staff in a bookstore, I mean, something that we encourage our clients to do, and I think again is appropriate in any team, and back to that sort of universality of neurodiversity as well, is to really recognize that everybody processes information differently and communicates differently. And sometimes we'll make this point to a group of learners in a corporate organization, and they look slightly cynical. And then we'll do a show of hands on, who prefers Slack versus talking on the phone versus in person. And of course, everybody puts their hands up for different things. And suddenly people start thinking, actually, there's something to this. So I think having sometimes people are sort of scared to talk about this kind of stuff, but having an open dialogue and recognizing that, and manager to employee or colleague to colleague, just being able to talk and ask and self-advocate and say, this is how I like to communicate the best. I think it can be really powerful, both at a sort of bilateral level and also at a team level. And again, when we work with corporates, we find that often, a team has, 7 or 8 ways that they communicate. And actually, when you do a little bit of digging, you find that, several of those are massively the preference. And a couple of those might be hated by half the team, but they just sort of do it because they've always done it. So you can do a sort of communication audit. And again, none of this is all universal design. None of this requires, labeling. None of this requires disclosure. And I think it's just going to be good for everybody. And so I would encourage, within a team, the thoughts to do that when it comes to things like instructions or whatever it is.
Wonderful. Do you have anything else to add on this, Katy or Jory?
No, I mean, I think that really sums it up. And I think it's just finding the benefits for everyone. And I think the openness is, it's the crux of this entire problem. But, and I say problem because we faced with problems as someone, if I'm in a workplace, sometimes with dyslexia, sometimes I see it as a problem. But I think it's the openness that's the hardest one to achieve. And a lot of that's because you're asking people to just change how they've done things or how things have always been done. So being able to push change forward, I think, is really important. And I really like some of those examples you've just provided with, put your hand up, what do you prefer, Slack? Do you prefer telephone? To just find those actually concrete examples that happen in everyday life to everyone.
Yeah, and as Katie and Ed mentioned, there's, to me, when I hear about openness, it implies that willingness to change. And I definitely don't think that whether it's in small ways or in larger structural ways, I don't think anyone should ever really discount the power of change to make a space or a team more inclusive.
Thank you. And last on this topic, Jory, is just that neurotypical people often feel pretty anxious asking questions, which is similar to what we talked about earlier. But now that we've got a little more framing for this, what would you tell people who are afraid of being invasive for expressing their curiosity?
Yeah. I think it depends on what the reason behind why you're asking the question, which was sort of what I was trying to get at, right? And I think if it comes from that place of commenting on something that you might find odd or disruptive, and if it's not sort of absolutely essential that it be addressed, that may be a topic where I always sort of have a worry that I'm not coming across very well or that I'm making some sort of mistake. And, sometimes it'd be helpful to be notified if I am doing that. But if it's just sort of a little bit sort of different than the norm, maybe having that just be natural, as just sort of, this is just how communication is operating right now, and it's not causing any problems, so I'm not going to comment on it. That I think is really important. But then I think there are a number of ways to kind of have the other side that I mentioned, kind of maybe the positive intentions and way of approaching those kind of questions. And I think the reason why I suggested maybe asking it later on is because you then have something positive to tie it to. Like for example, in my book reading habits, I'm, certain that the fact that I have autism shapes both the way I read and the things that I enjoy. But some of the things that I didn't think that I would enjoy about reading have come from others. So I recently, a friend recommended that I read books that were translated. And I thought, well, I have enough difficulty with one language, never mind something that was first written in another language and then translated into English. But, I'm really glad that I listened to my friend's suggestion because it introduced me to a whole genre that I hadn't really engaged with before. Mm-hmm. And so maybe the bookseller can be a way to help address that, right? Because I had a thought like, I'll never be able to pick up a translated book and read it. I have autism, languages struggle enough already. But really, it was that encouragement that led me into a new positive experience. And so in that way, somebody knowing that I have autism and asking me that question was positive, I think, for both of us.
Yeah, I can second some of those. Another kind of good example is also the font that's used. So someone had suggested a font to me a couple years ago, which is created specifically for dyslexics. And I kind of thought, font, it's going to make no difference to my ability to be able to read. And I read a document in it, and it was, I'll admit, on the panel, I actually cried, and I'm not really a crier, because the ability that I had to read that document that was less exhausting, so much easier. And it was because I started a conversation with someone who said, well, I'm not dyslexic, but I have heard that, why don't you try it? So they felt comfortable enough to make suggestions. So I think, like you said, it depends where it comes from. And yeah, maybe not picking up or asking questions around things that are clearly potentially hurtful are beneficial. Yeah.
I love that example because it takes us right into our final segment, which is making bookstores more inclusive places. And the first question I want to ask is, what are some simple changes that are universal that we can make to help neurodiverse people feel more welcome? And one of those would just be using fonts that are dyslexia friendly, because that costs us nothing, that causes no stress for anyone else, but it makes a world of difference, as you've just shared, for someone who needs it. So overall, if we think about our workflows, our environments, our processes, what can we put in place as bookstore owners or managers to help neurodiverse people, maybe make the environment better for everyone else too, but specifically our booksellers and our customers? thinking about anything from hiring and scheduling. We talked about communication, how we design our break spaces, how we manage sensory overload, any of those things. So with that, Katy, if you don't mind, we'll start with you.
So yeah, for books, and I know some publishers already do this, but there are books now that are published with dyslexic friendly fonts.
Mm-hmm.
And that, they think about the spacing, the font, that really helps. So as a bookseller, kind of maybe just being aware of maybe what some of those books are in publishers, having a section that's, and if you don't need to market, dyslexic friendly, but maybe having a section where, as a mother, if I'm going to look for a book for my child and I know she's struggling with reading, I know where to look as a first point of call. Or if it's for me, if I don't necessarily feel comfortable, I can go up and kind of look for the book without having to ask for help right away. And I think especially young children who might be looking for books for themselves if they're in the shop with their parents, or even as they get older by themselves, not having to go up when you're young and say, "Excuse me, I have trouble reading. Where can I find books that are easy for me?" Because a lot of it's just trying to avoid that feeling of humiliation, especially in the younger readers. So I think having things clearly marked, maybe think about signs, and just being on hand to help, or being aware of some of the questions you might get that you might need to help support from your customers.
Thank you. And Ed, what processes can you recommend to those of us in very small businesses, particularly where we have 2 or 4 or 10 employees maximum, that can just create a more inclusive setting?
Yeah, I think one of the problems in this whole field is that, as I said at the beginning, everything has defaulted to what suits the sort of non-neurodistinct. And so, the preferences of people who have, for example, stronger sensory sensitivities have been ignored. And one of the principles we try to encourage is, allowing individuals or even groups to sort of shape their own experiences and environments as much as possible. So I think a couple of really simple things that organizations could do around environments, and sorry if this sounds trite, is sort of surveying or asking the staff, what sort of environment do they want to work in, how could it be improved, and probably surveying visitors as well, and having a 5-question survey and say, look, we're committed to having an inclusive environment for everybody. And lots of people aren't going to fill it out because lots of people are going to be comfortable in the space, but people who aren't, or maybe conscious that their kid might not be, they will, and I think they'll learn a lot. And the example from our work here is that we were working with an investment bank. Investment bank has this big office in London, and they were refitting an entire floor, and they had this whole vision of what it would look like, and being modern and open and high tech, and they weren't going to ask anybody who was going to sit there what they wanted and whether that's what they wanted. And so thanks to working with us, and credit to them, they did. So before they built this office, they surveyed everybody who's going to sit there, and they said, what are you worried about? What makes you uncomfortable? How could we make this space more inclusive? And they did it. And so I think that same principle really applies here.
Yeah,
wonderful.
One of the things that I found as well with teams, whether small, kind of three people in the team or other, is also thinking about, we don't all have to sit together. If you think about the traditional way of sitting, right? We don't all have to sit together in the same space. And I think actually I don't know what it's like over there, but in London, we're in lockdown, we're still at home. So, it helps, right? So maybe this opens some eyes, because we don't have to sit together. Maybe we sit together because it's based on what our sensory capacity is for that day, or more generally, like I'll come into the office when I am in an office, and I'll have headphones on for the first couple of hours just to acclimatize myself. Yeah. Could there be a space where, if someone wants to, they can go work in a quiet space? Don't have to all be together all the time as well. So thinking about the space also in sensory pockets, I think would be helpful, because everybody's going to have changes, whether it's during the day or constantly, that they're going to want to be able to accommodate and move around and be comfortable.
I love that. Jory, do you have other thoughts on what those of us in small bookstores can do?
Yeah, I think I actually sometimes prefer small spaces because no, that's not always the case, but it's sometimes the case that there's less going on, and it's a more sort of open space. There's fewer design features that have not been, built with not me in mind, I'll say. And I think that even if it's a small space, the bookseller is sort of the master of that space, right? There are things they can do, whether it's simple environmental cues like lighting or sound, whether it's the books themselves, being able to introduce people to the concept of neurodiversity, or making neurodiverse people feel welcome in your bookstore by having a variety of experiences available for them to purchase. And then even thinking about what is the things that your bookstore does, right? Community bookstores, I often love smaller community bookstores, including the one where I live, because they really do a lot of interesting things. And I think maybe, as Ed was saying, what about making a list of those things? And maybe if all of them really thrive with people that are really keen to engage in highly social group extroverted conversations, maybe that's an opportunity to balance it with an event that's more low key, or maybe like a board game evening or something to that effect, where you could also use board games that have something to do with books or paper, and then you could have some books available about sort of board games. I'm sure there's at least a few fantasy stories of being sucked into a game. And so I think there's a lot of things that small bookstores can do because they're small, to really engage with the community and be out there and be vocal and be a positive contribution to the discussion.
So on that note, regarding bookstores' role in our communities and the events we can host, one of our members of the ABA has a dyslexic child, and they celebrate Dyslexia Awareness Month by giving Readia specialists a percentage off. That's in October. So when we're thinking about promotions or support to recognize and celebrate neurodiversity in books, what are some of the ways that bookstores can play that role in our community of increasing awareness and understanding? And that can be for you, Jory, or if either of the others have ideas right off the bat.
Yeah, so one of the things is, and I love the idea of the discounts. Wish I were close by. I'd be benefiting from that. One other thing would also be to have, I think, being able to showcase maybe some role models. So, especially if you've got a young child with learning disability, sometimes you don't know what you're capable of, because you're limited by the world being set for people who just function in a different way. So showcasing maybe authors. Could you showcase authors who are neurodiverse? If dyslexic authors, if I had seen that when I was young, I'd be like, wow, you mean someone can write? Because I can't. It took me much longer to. So showcasing not just the books, but maybe the people behind the books that have been able to do things, so that, the young children coming in and say, it's not just me. I can do these things too. And they can learn about people who have accomplished a lot because their differences make them stronger.
I love that. That's very, very good tie into the work that we do already as booksellers. Ed or Jory, would you like to add anything to that?
No, other than to second Katie's point, that I think that the ability of a bookstore to be that sort of light in a community and to bring awareness, but also bring additional perspectives and in general, just a great contribution, shouldn't really be discounted.
Absolutely.
I would maybe just add that, that it's such a huge population and affinity group. I think this is a huge opportunity for booksellers actually to engage with their community, and it's something we've seen in in corporates. You know, sometimes the person launching a program is, you know, feels very isolated, and you know, maybe they're neurodistinct themselves, and they don't know, you know, they're not sort of disclosed. They don't know how this is going to be welcomed and reacted to. And then, you know, fast forward a few months, and you know, you find out that the chief operating officer is dyslexic, and you know, he's got a big budget, and a bunch of managers come out and say, you know, I'm autistic, or my son, and you know, suddenly you have there's this huge sort of latent I think interest in the topic, and it's really so belated that as humans we're only starting to talk about this now, you know, when we've all been, you know, collaborating, working together, and indeed, you know, even making and buying books for hundreds of years. So I think you will see, by talking about this topic in an open and positive way, and not worrying about the precision of language. I think it's all about the intent, and people recognize that. I think you will see a huge response in the community. And then again, back to my earlier point, start giving the community the room to ideate in terms of what you can do beyond that.
Wonderful. So before we move on from this section, I want to call out the needs of children with neurodiversity. My son's autistic. A lot of booksellers focus on or have special spaces for children. And with that, we've talked quite a bit about sensory challenges, some of the overstimulation people can experience. So if we can think about that as far as if someone is hypersensitive to light or sound or touch, or maybe needs more of those things and is seeking them, as well as how we can be more inclusive in how we lay out our books, such as the distinctions by age. So things that we can do to be welcoming to children in our bookstores. And I'll just say, as a parent, one thing is assuming that a child is trying their best, because my son has often been judged for misbehaving when he's just being himself. So that's something I'll throw out there. But how about the rest of you? Katy, we could start with you. I know you've mentioned being a parent.
Yes, so I'm a parent, and I think the main thing that you said is the kids, they're trying, right? They're trying, they want to go. And especially if I look at it from a dyslexic child's perspective, whether it's my experiences or the experiences I'm kind of witnessing as a parent, is a bookstore is almost a fearful place, because you're going in, no matter how much you love stories or reading, and you're seeing all of these things that you pick up a book and you struggle to read it, or it takes you such a long time to read it. So having the space to let them sit down, you know, the child can sit down, look through the books, not have it by age, which I don't know what it's like in America, but over here, sometimes in bookstores, you still will find, you know, categorized by age. Because, you know, you don't want a 10-year-old going up to a bookshelf for 10-year-olds and finding they can't read it, and they have to go over to 6 and they get embarrassed. So giving them also the space to sit down and read some of the books quietly without interruption, to see whether or not, you know, let's break down that fear, because books are the most amazing thing. So I think as a parent, it would be that it's that welcoming environment where, also if I'm asking, you know, my child would like a book, you know, they're into mysteries. Don't just ask the age. Kind of ask a few more questions. And I think you get that a lot in the smaller bookstores, especially, where they'll ask lots of questions. Okay, so, you know, what else do you like reading? And then they can gauge the age range and make some really great suggestions. But I have had situations as well where they'll just say, well, how old? And I'm like, that's not helpful. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as Katy mentioned, there's a lot to think about in terms of the space. But then, as Ed was mentioning about, and Katy there at the end, really kind of what I imagine is the core functions of a bookseller is selling books. And I think being flexible and creative with selling books to children as an audience, and children that are neurodiverse, can be a skill set that any bookseller can try and be intentional about growing. And that could be, you know, moving away from age ranges and instead asking creative questions like, you know, what was the last book that you read that really excited you, or even creative questions to gauge topics of interest among children. And then I think there's also a ton of ways where booksellers can use their knowledge of books to really guide their recommendations. Thinking about alternative formats like graphic novels, pop-up books. I know there's at least one children's author that I am somewhat familiar with, David Wisner, who makes stories with no words at all. Mm-hmm. And I think that booksellers may be in many cases more aware of that than their customers, and is something that they could really a valuable contribution that they could make to those people that come into the bookshop.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we're talking about kind of people coming in and the books they want to read. And sometimes customers ask us, say, they have a 10-year-old niece they need to shop for. And sometimes that's the first thing they'll say. And just as not all nieces are the same and not all 10-year-olds are the same, sometimes they'll say, my nephew's autistic, so what should I buy? And thinking about, that question and how we can best respond to that customer can be a little tricky. So how would you advise that we guide that conversation and then get that recommendation to them? And Jory, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, I'll start us off. Yeah. And I'll start us off kind of almost where I left off, where when you get a question like that, I think there's kind of an easy answer, which is to direct them to an age range. But there's the more maybe creative answer, which is, of course, thinking about, when someone mentions something like autism, you could think about representation in the book itself. But I think there's also room to ask, that person shopping, what was the last book that they told you about? Or what are they just really interested about to gauge topics? And I think those are areas where then the bookseller can take in all that information and sort of provide and get a better sense of, okay, like this is even, you can kind of try to guesstimate like reading level or what books may be interested based on prior books that they've told that person about, and there's ways where you can really, I think, use your knowledge as a bookseller to kind of make what could be a very blunt conversation, a much more inviting conversation, and one that highlights the expertise of the bookseller, really.
Yeah, I love how you talk about booksellers, so thank you.
Well, I love booksellers. Really I know my local bookseller by name, it's great.
Yeah, it's so true. It's like it's that kind of thinking outside the box. Not too long ago, I went into a bookstore with my daughter, and she's a fan of Harry Potter. Right? But clearly hard to read. And so one of the sections was get an audiobook, right? And so the bookstore said, get the audiobook. And actually, why don't you get this book to go with it? And it was more picture-based. So there were some of the images, so she could listen to the book. And I know that they didn't get any money from suggesting that book to me. I got this beautiful illustrated book to go with the audiobook, but it was this sparks and this kind of grows that love of learning. And I think when you go into a bookstore, most of the time, 99% of the time, the people that work where they love books too. And it's great to see kind of just coming at it from all different angles to nurture the love of reading and the love of books.
So we have just a few minutes left. So as we're wrapping up, just thinking about any last things you could share to help us with our bookselling staff to play to their strengths. We have people who have maybe really struggled to keep their register right balanced when they're talking with customers, but they're great at organizing. So the last thought would just be making our staff really feel like we're playing to their strengths. Any thoughts on that?
So I think that's down to every manager. So for example, I should never be put in charge of the register unless it's an Excel spreadsheet. If it's an Excel spreadsheet, I'll do whatever you want on it. Fine. Don't ask me to give someone change. So I think it's kind of thinking and saying, okay, well, then why don't, let's say, Katy, why don't you can go in the back room and you do all of this. You do all of the forecasting, you do all of the crunching, you set up all of those formulas. This person can be on the register. So just think about the people you have. And if you don't have as many, just maybe there's simpler ways to do it, where you take turns, or you can be on hand, and just encourage your staff then maybe to say, if I am at the register, to say, look, I'm really sorry. This is going to take me a bit of time. Get the calculator out, calculate it, so that they can be open with the customer if they do have to do that activity.
Definitely. Any last thoughts, Jory or Ed, just real quick?
Yeah, I love that point. I think that's really, really important. We sometimes think of a worker or an employee. It doesn't matter if it's in a bookstore or in a bank. It's the same. If you think about their job responsibilities as sort of 100% bar, that bar is made up of different tasks, different things. Often there's one core piece of it that might be 80%, the main thing that being hired to do, but there's lots of other pieces. And I think, from what we've learned, neurodivergent people can be particularly sort of spiky in that they can be incredibly good at the main part and then have unusual challenges with some of the other parts. And being open to that and not expecting that everyone has to be good at everything. I mean, that's a sports team doesn't do that. We don't have the same person kicking as catching and running. So, let's start doing that as businesses. And I think we'll create better organizations as a result.
Yeah. The fallacy of the unicorn employee doesn't exist.
No.
Sure.
And I'll add a final thought from me in that I think that by attending the session and listening in, I think regardless of where you started, I hope that you've learned something new. And so maybe the next step for you is to say, how can I apply this in my own experience or my own bookstore, and really kind of make it concrete in your next interaction, because you may not know if you're interacting with a neurodiverse person if they don't disclose, as we mentioned. Yeah. And so thank you to Emily and to our ASL translators and to everyone at ABA who invited me to be part of this conversation, as well as my fellow panelists, Katy and Ed. I've really loved being here, and I hope that the people watching have too.
I am pretty confident that everyone who watches this will get something out of it. So I want to thank all of you for the immense effort that you've put into this. This has, I know, been a lot of work for all of you. So thank you for sharing with us, just helping us understand the concept of neurodiversity, what your experiences have been, and how we can become much more inclusive in our bookstores and our communities. And thank you to everyone who has watched this today. We hope you enjoy the rest of the Institute. And if you have specific ideas for how we can continue this conversation about neurodiversity and bookselling, you can contact Lisa Wynn, lisa@bookweb.org, or Stephanie Choi, Stephanie with a Y, @bookweb.org. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!